here today. We are pleased to have you here, and we have a great program coming up that I know you will enjoy. But I also want to point out that this is our 50th anniversary meeting, the first meeting of the Historical Society. This Historical Society occurred in January of 1973, and to give you a little idea of who the folks were who started this organization, they were James M. Simmons, familiar name to many people, Eva Coe Peden, Charles Howard Peden, Martha Renault Harrison, Marion Vance, Kenneth H. Lee, Billy Vaughn, Dr. Charles T. Woodward, Levon Woodward, and Ralph Morgan. And we are especially pleased today that we have one of those people with us. And sitting back in the back corner there is Martha Harrison, who has given literally 50 years to this organization, and it is greatly appreciated, Martha. Martha worked especially on our quarterly publication for many years and has contributed so much to the research of historical records in Barren County and especially with cemeteries. She, like many of us, enjoys cemeteries quite a bit, and we like to explore who's there and try to keep up with those folks. So we are so pleased to have you here today. Martha, incidentally, was honored by our board last year as an emeritus board member, lifetime status, and we always appreciate her contributions. We have some other great programs coming up that I want to give you a little information about, and we'll have a flyer released hopefully in the next few days. But next month we will have a program by Susan Lyons Hughes, who formerly worked for the Kentucky Historical Society, Shakertown at Pleasant Hill. She was their education director, but she's going to be coming to talk about the Underground Railroad and Underground Railroad quilts that many people find a fascinating bit of history. In March we will have a program on Barren County's forgotten suffragists. We've not heard much about suffragists in Barren County, but we did have them. We just didn't record their history, unfortunately. In April, we will have Gary Dillard, who is going to share his very interesting program on the history of the navigation of the Green River and how it impacted all of this area of Kentucky. And in May, we are going to be taking a field trip of sorts. Mike and Beth Wagner, who have been restoring a couple of buildings on our downtown square, have agreed to give us a private tour of all the things that they've been doing there. And so I think that will be a fun thing to see. You know, who knew all of that stained glass was in those half-circle windows on the front of the buildings there. So we have some neat things coming up. But today we have the honor of having Bill Goodman, obviously a Glasgow native, and has had many roles in his life that range from a television personality in Nashville, Kentucky Educational Television. We welcomed him into our living rooms every week for many years there, and now he is charting new waters with the Kentucky Humanities Council, and he's also an author. So we're pleased to have you here with us today, Bill, and to share a little bit of information. Your cousin Charlie has graciously come to fact check as you go along, and so just beware. Welcome.
Thank you, Sam. First of all, I want to say that I appreciate very much the invitation that you gave to Charlie and to William Taylor and to any other Goodmans that happen to be in the audience. this afternoon. It's indeed an honor to be back in my hometown, and just like Charlie's uncle said many times, I've always, wherever I've been, whether it was in Nashville for a while, or in Houston, Texas when I worked down there, or back to Kentucky in Lexington, or all over the Commonwealth as I traveled, and now at Kentucky Humanities, that I have always told people that I was from Barren County and from Glasgow, and I'm so proud to be a native of this fine city. And I never hesitate to identify myself as someone from Glasgow. So I appreciate the opportunity to come back. Haven't been back that often to do so. So I do appreciate the fact that Sam reached out to me earlier and asked if I would come and help you celebrate your 50th anniversary. We just ended our 50th anniversary at Kentucky Humanities last year, and this is our 51st year of beginning a new era at Kentucky Humanities. I also want to take this opportunity to tell everyone that I want to thank Sam publicly, who is the real father and the person who gets all the credit for the Think History segments that some of you have already mentioned that you're hearing on WKYU radio. It is a love of mine and of many Kentuckians now, and I'll tell you just a brief history of Think History. When we were looking around for something at Kentucky Humanities that related to history, I remember very distinctly after a board meeting where our board chair, Tom Appleton, who was a distinguished history professor at Eastern Kentucky University, and Dwayne Boland, who unfortunately has just passed away in the last year, a distinguished professor of history at Murray, were in a conversation about how concerned they were about the lack of knowledge about our state, about the history of what went on before, about how young people aren't being taught because it's not a requirement anymore the way it was in Mr. Simmons' class or Mr. Brown's class. It is an elective in some schools, and some schools don't even offer it at that. It's up to the teacher whether to teach Kentucky history, and most schools aren't even doing that at all. So we, I think at that time, Dr. Appleton was familiar with what Sam was doing on Facebook, and he reached out to Sam and asked Sam if we could have permission to begin to look at some of his material. And Tom began to negotiate with Sam, and we got some of that literature together. Tom began to write some of those. We've now hired a historian out of Louisville who puts them all together. Our editor for the magazine in our office, Marianne Stess, does all of the audio editing. I'm just the fortunate one who is handed the script and asked to go into our very small podcast studio at our Kentucky Humanities office on Maxwell Street and record those. We have pretty close to 800, if not more, of those recorded now. We started airing those on public radio a few years ago on WEKU at Richmond. We're now on 4 public radio stations. And I think I just told Eddie a few minutes ago that I have a meeting with WFPL, that's the public station in Louisville, on Monday, to persuade them, or at least do a little bit of arm twisting to see if they would be the only holdout, public radio-wise, that are not carrying our Think History segments. So WKYU came on board, I believe, in June of this year, and they've been probably as recognizable when I'm out and speak and talk to people. They recognize that we do produce and voice those. It's been not only have I learned a great deal about the history of Kentucky, both sometimes funny and frivolous, and there are sports stories, but they're also deeply researched in the history of Kentucky and how we became such a great Commonwealth. So I hope you, if you haven't listened to them, they're all on our website. They're cataloged and archived there, but they're also on WKYU radio. So I want to thank Sam for that. Also, if he's the one responsible for the little Facebook picture that he put together and this terrific graphic, if it wasn't Sam, it was somebody very clever that I'm going to talk about 4 famous relatives I've known. I want to thank you very much, Sam, for using a picture that's about 20 years old, maybe 15 years old. I like that one. I have it blown up. It's in my office, and it's gotten some comment from people. So that's my glamour photo, and that's if I wanted a better photo, I should have sent you one, right? Just like you asked me to. So you found your own photo, and I appreciate that. You know, that's a whole lot like I've had some great experiences with some wonderful people. And one of those was with Al Smith. A lot of you will remember Al Smith and what he did for Kentucky as the Comment on Kentucky anchor for so many, many years. And he was a friend and taught me a lot about the history of Kentucky and just conversations not only on the air but off the air too. And I was at a Kroger in Lexington one time, and I saw a lady who appeared like she knew who I was, and she sort of came up a little bit closer and smiled and greeted and nodded and said, I know who you are. And I said, yes, ma'am. You're on television. I said, yes, ma'am. I am. Thank you very much. She said, I watch you every night. So, thank you, ma'am. He said, you're Al Smith, aren't you? I said, no, ma'am, Al's a little bit older. He's on Friday nights and I'm on Monday nights. And she said, oh. Kind of walked away. And one more story, because I think it's funny, Charlie, I hope you do. You may have heard John Meacham, the historian and author, tell this story. But John Meacham was at the National Book Awards in Washington on the lawn. And that's where the authors go for the National Book Festival, under big tents. And a lady did the same thing to Mr. Meacham. Kind of shy, kind of came up. Finally, she sidled over to him and said, I love your books. I just love your writing. He said, John Meacham is not a humble person. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. If I go get one of your books, would you sign it for me? He said, of course I would. So she went off, went back and met with the book, laid it down in front of John Meacham. It was John Grisham's book. He looked up at her. He signed John Grisham. Thank you very much. So that's a true story. I do want to spend just a few minutes this afternoon talking about some relatives of mine that you may or may not have been familiar with. I know some of you are familiar with some of them, and some that you're not. These are relatives that are on either one side or the other of my family. And I want you to know right now that I am not a historian. I'm not trained in the scholarship. What I have cobbled together for you today is something that I've done from pieces here and there, and I'm going to give as much credit as I possibly can to the rightful authors of a lot of this information. But I want to tell you about a couple of people that you may or may not be that familiar with before we get into some people that you may be a little bit more familiar with. Thomas Walker, in 1791, Dr. Thomas Walker's son said this. He wrote this in a piece about his father. Francis Thomas wrote, He possesses all that life and good humor which we were all kept alive by in the woods. How happy is the man at his age can with pleasure look back on a life well spent, a life without distress, and meet the awful moment which is to deprive his descendants of so estimable friend. In other words, we should all live as well as Dr. Thomas Walker did. Much of the history of Walker's life has been researched by another distant relative, not by me or a member of my close family, but a physician in Nashville, Tennessee named Dr. McLeod. Dr. McLeod has done a yeoman's worth of work in his kinship with the family, and a lot of what I'm going to tell you today about the history of Dr. Thomas Walker was from Dr. McLeod's work in a publication that he's been involved in. Dr. Thomas Walker is a man who is often overlooked as the first white man to come through the Cumberland Gap. At the time it was not named the Cumberland Gap. He named it the Cumberland Gap. Now I don't know how many people in school today or growing up, or how when you realize that it wasn't Daniel Boone that was the first white man to come through the Cumberland Gap. And I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but I would be one of those that didn't know a thing about Dr. Thomas Walker until I was certainly an adult and probably at Kentucky Educational Television. But that was my shortcoming of not knowing who he was. But I'll fill in a few of the blanks. He had friends in high places. His wife was a second cousin to George Washington, so he had some kinship with some others there. For example, he also had a connection with Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark fame. He was a trained physician, but he was also a government official. He did a lot of work for the fledgling Virginia Commonwealth at the time. He was called upon as a man who had a vision for westward expansion of the territory, and he took that upon along with his being a physician, being a merchant, being a farmer, and being an explorer. When they didn't really use that word a lot back then, he was the man that they looked to. As a young man, he possessed a sense of adventure and made frequent trips as far as he could westward into the Virginia territory and even into what would become West Virginia. He was called upon by the government to begin to look at a westward expansion, not knowing exactly what he would find. He had had a number of occasions when he was in discussions with Native Americans about what would lie beyond just the boundaries that the white man had traveled. One of the most interesting pieces of history that I think we could learn about is that, and from him, is firsthand, because Dr. Thomas Walker kept a detailed journal of all of the travels that he took throughout his life. He kept a diary, if you will. And so we have in his own words and his own handwriting the explorations that he made. He describes the Kentucky that he, or at that time was not Kentucky, but the land that he saw as rugged. It was a place where it was very wild. The Appalachian Mountains were very steep and rocky. He had, with a small band of men, spent a lot of time hunting. They killed all manner of wildlife, from bear, elk, you name it. They had it and took those words back to the people that he reported back to. He made the trip to the Cumberland Gap and even farther, naming the river after the Duke of Cumberland and other places. He was the first white man to build and given credit for building a structure, the first structure, cabin, very crude, built at what we now know as Union County in Barberville, Kentucky, which was again just in the wilds of what is now our state, but at the time was the westward part of Virginia. In one of his concluding essays, Dr. Walker wrote in an essay that McLeod put together, that he wrote that the origins in Tidewater, Virginia to the Mississippi run from New York into the North Carolina to the south. Let me start this again. The legacy of Dr. Walker knows the intellect and inquiring adventure of some spirit of concern for human beings and animals, both in medicine and in his in family characteristics. It reflects the best of the American dream, but most important, Walker pointed the way west and left the imprint on the future expansion of the new nation he loved and helped forge. I would be remiss if I didn't give a lot of credit to my niece, Beth Barton, who is a native of Glasgow in Barren County. She's done a great deal of the work in our family history and genealogy, and she has put together an elaborate family tree of how we are kin to Dr. Thomas Walker. It's if you can imagine the 1700s, it goes back quite a bit. But she's done the work, and we believe her, and we will hold to that. At the same time, in a period of time of 1744 to 1782, the birth and death of Stephen Trigg. Again, I want to give plenty of credit to my niece Beth for putting together the genealogy and the family tree on how we're related to Stephen Trigg. We are related to Stephen, who was the brother to our direct relative, Colonel William Trigg. Both were sons of Judge William Trigg and Mary Johns. If there was information from Dr. Thomas Walker's work, his journals, there was not much that can be found on Stephen Trigg other than his infamous and tragic death, which we will mention and talk about in just a minute. Stephen Trigg did die a tragic death at 38 years old at the Battle of Blue Licks, which we'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. But while he was alive, it was found that he was an active citizen of the new Commonwealth of Virginia. He was a government official. He was a parish government representative. He was a member of the militia. He served in the precursor of what would become the Declaration of Independence. There are plenty of places where it is pointed out in our history where he was at the table during treaty settlements, and as a young man was asked to be involved in a lot of early government decisions. He also was a person who was called upon to begin to look westward, to be given the opportunity to go into the new expansion of what is now known as Kentucky, when Daniel Boone and others were established the fort at Harrodsburg, Fort Herod, which is now Harrodsburg, but Fort Herod. Stephen Trigg was asked to take up a residence there. He was also, for his, as the times and the awards were given for his work there, was awarded 1,000 acres in a location about 4 miles north of Harrodsburg called Trigg's Station. That is somewhat suspect in the history that we've been able to look at. Trigg Station, there is a marker there on a private property on a county road. The private property owner has not allowed anyone or a family member, including myself, to enter that area to do any sort of work or to examine the land or the house. That is one of those missions that you're often thinking about and wanting to look into. But we do know that Stephen Trigg was at Fort Harrod, that he did establish Trigg's Station, and he was also involved in a very aggressive move against a tribe of Native Americans who were with the British, created a battle at what is present-day Bryan Station outside of Lexington, which some of you might be familiar with that name. It was in February of 1782 when, after the battle at Bryan Station, he was there was an incursion in the Blue Licks area of Kentucky, the Licking River, you might be familiar with. He was at the time, had been made a lieutenant colonel. He left that area with a troop of 135 militiamen. The other sector that were the fighting forces was led by Daniel Boone and a couple of other military generals. They were ambushed at the Battle of Blue Licks, and within 5 minutes, Stephen Trigg was slaughtered and killed. Israel Boone, Daniel Boone's son, was also killed. And when they went back to recover the bodies, there really wasn't a body to recover. There was a mass grave there. The Blue Lick State Park is dedicated to that battle, which is said to be the last battle of the Revolutionary War. And there's a monument there. Stephen Trigg's name is prominently mentioned, along with the other soldiers and private citizens and men that were killed there. So that's the kinship that we have with Stephen Trigg. He was couple of historians, and I'm not familiar with and did not look up their credentials, but did find the quote a Lewis and Richard Collins wrote of Stephen Trigg that he was greatly beloved and very popular, and that he had lived would have ranked among the most distinguished men of his time. So that is cousin Stephen Trigg. Now my cousin Julian Goodman is next. So Charlie, the first question I have for you, and I want to again give full faith and credit, by the way, to Anthony Harkins at Western Kentucky University, who wrote an excellent piece for the Kentucky Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, for putting together a lot of this information that I'm going to be imparting today, along with family stories and remembrances and some writings that I also found. But the first question that I have that I could not find, that I asked Tony Harkins about, is Julian's middle name.
Barren.
And where did that come from in the family tree?
He was named after a used car salesman in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Did everybody hear that? It was named after a used car salesman in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Julian Barren Goodman, and I could not find B-Y-R-N.
E, I think, on the end of it. But
Is there an E?
I don't know.
I could not find the E.
The family lived in Murfreesboro for a short period of time, and one of Granddad's big friends was Julian Barren, used car salesman, a notable used car salesman in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
I'm not sure. And that's a true. Okay. All right. Well, we'll accept that, Charles Austin.
I'm a lawyer.
That's all we know, Charlie.
Well, I'm glad we clarified that, and I even asked the author of the article, a distinguished PhD at Western Kentucky University, Anthony Harkins, if he would help me with that, and he couldn't find it either. So wait till I tell him about that. But all of you know that Julian was born here in Glasgow in 1922 to Charles Austin Goodman and Sarah Franklin Goodman. John Jacob Goodman, you've all heard the story, I'm sure, at least we have in the family, had 32 children with 2 wives. And there are a lot of Goodmans around the area of Fountain Run and Monroe County and Glasgow and Barren County. Julian had 2 brothers, Charlie and Robert, or Charles and Robert, and they grew up here just like William Taylor and Charlie and Bobby and Billy and Joe and a number of other Goodmans did. He went to Western Kentucky State Teachers College. He served a stint in the Army. He went from the Army, didn't graduate from Western, but later graduated from Georgetown with an economics degree, and went right from college into NBC Radio and began his work there. He's best known for a number of accomplishments in broadcasting. As you know, starting as a radio newsman at that time and running into people like Chet Huntley and David Brinkley, and later putting that program and those 2 people together much later than when he just ran into them in the newsroom, was an accomplishment in itself. But Julian is also very much responsible for the coverage that NBC put together on the Kennedy assassination, the funeral, the great debates of 1960 with Kennedy and Nixon. There is a lot on the internet of Julian talking about these events and describing the trials and tribulations of what it was like to be an NBC News president, and then a president of the entire network. Julian was certainly somebody that we all looked up to. As I said, he spent some time in radio. He worked hard, worked long hours. I think Charlie and his brother Bob were fortunate enough for at least 1 or 2 summers to get an internship at the Tonight Show in New York.
Pages for NBC.
Pages for NBC. I'm going to knock this thing over. And so when I was at Western, Julian also told the story at one time that when he came back to speak at Western, and he had not graduated at that time from Western, then he pointed that out. He said, of course, getting into Western and having your cousin be the president of the university, that was D. Rowe Downing, wasn't a bad idea either. You could get just about anything you wanted, including a speaking engagement at Western. The only time that I had any association with him in New York was when I knew that my cousins Bobby and Charlie had been pages, and I didn't see any reason why I shouldn't go up there and do the same thing. I was a little bit older and a little bit more mature.
I didn't think much.
So I took a Greyhound bus to New York, stayed at the YMCA, made my way up to 30 Rockefeller Center, and took the elevator up. William Taylor, just like that story you were telling me about trying to get through. If you've got the right credentials and you're going to see the chairman of the NBC, You can get in the elevator, right? Rode up there, and the elevator, it didn't just open up to another floor, it opened to his office, if I remember correctly. And it wasn't just a little cubicle. It had a couch in it and a big desk, and he was sitting behind the desk, and he always pronounced my name in the truest Barren County way, just like y'all talk, you know. Billy, what can I do for you? And I said, well, Cousin Julian, I call him that. I've been at Western, and I've been studying broadcasting and journalism, and I think I'm ready to maybe come up here and work. He said, the best advice I can give you is to get right back on that Greyhound bus and go right back to Western Kentucky University, get your degree, then you can come back up here and see me. Now, I'd just gotten off a Greyhound bus, stayed in the YMCA, gotten all the way to Rockefeller Center. How I found that, I'll never know. And that's the advice he gave me, and which was true, and that's what I did. Except I didn't go back to New York, I went to Nashville instead. I got mixed up on my directions. So that's just one story. Charlie, why don't you tell the story that he often told that's almost folklore, that I'm sure y'all have heard, but it never hurts to hear it again, about when Julian got his promotion from maybe vice president to president. Stand up so everybody can hear you.
All right. I want to get attribution on this, when you report about it. Julian had just been named president of the National Broadcasting Company. In his excitement, the first thing that he wanted to do was to call his father, my grandfather, old man Charlie, and announce to him what a prestigious position he had just been nominated and appointed to. So he gets on the phone, and Granddad answers it, and he said, Granddad, I've got something to tell you. He said, your son, me, I have now been named as president of the National Broadcasting Company, and he wanted to continue and go on and explain the process and what that position entailed. But Granddad said, well, I think that's very nice, son, but I'm going to have to go because it's Jockey Day in Edmonton, and I've got to go down there and see about some cows. I want to tell one other one, though, that he flew into...
You're not getting paid for this, by the way.
He flew in a private jet to the Glasgow airport, and he wanted to show that to his father, my grandfather, and so he got my grandfather out to the Glasgow Municipal Airport, and he said, you know, Dad, I want you to look inside, see how nice it is. And Granddad said, nope, not going to do it. He said, what do you mean you're not going to do it? I'm not going to get in that airplane. He said, well, what could make you get in that airplane? He said, if you give me the keys. So we had the pilot hand Granddad the keys to the plane to make sure it wouldn't take off. And then he went inside and looked.
The bottom line, and I want to pause here, just thank Sam once again for inviting me here today, because it sure has given me an opportunity to reflect on Glasgow and Barren County, and growing up here and going to our Goodman reunion, where I'll read about that for you in just a minute, but the Goodman reunion in Fountain Run was a part of our growing up, our being together, of looking at people like our fathers, our mothers, as people that we wanted to grow up and be like, because of the ethical integrity, the standards that they set forth for us, have been a path forward for, I think, every single one of us that have been privileged to be not only in this family, but in this town. And Julian never, ever, I don't think, as I mentioned at the very beginning, denied his roots and denied being He was given much credit for his rural upbringing and what it taught him while he was here. And he always carried that with him. This is a little piece about our cousin Joe Downing. We had talked about what he might wear to the family reunion. My 7-year-old sister and I at 10 had seen a picture of him. He was wearing what looked like some sort of dress or nightshirt similar to the one the father wore in the illustrations of the night before Christmas. In the photograph from Time magazine, he wore what appeared to be a wide-brimmed lady's hat with a dark band around the center. My mother said it was more like a dress, a floor-length cotton robe. She said that artists in France dressed that way. And she added, besides, your cousin Dudley is flamboyant. He has a certain flair about him. We looked over for a nod of confirmation from my dad, who was driving the car loaded with a couple of lawn chairs and picnic supplies we needed for the Goodman family reunion in Fountain Run, Kentucky. He murmured, "Uh-huh. Your mother knows what they wear in France." It was 1956, and every fourth Sunday in May since I could remember, and many more fourth Sundays before that, the Goodmans gathered for a family reunion in Monroe County at a small cemetery where our forefathers rested near the Tennessee border. For generations, this land had been celebrated as our home place. A couple of miles down the road from the cemetery was a dilapidated farmhouse where our great-great-great-grandfather had fathered 32 children. He was probably the most famous relative in the family until we learned more about our cousin Dudley, who was coming all the way from France and promised to be the highlight of this year's celebration. My mother had filled a platter with fried chicken, covered 24 deviled eggs with aluminum foil to keep them fresh, cooked enough potatoes for a bowl of potato salad, and made sweet tea and Kool-Aid to keep our thirst at bay during the hottest portions of the day. With the windows rolled down to let the late May breeze in, I settled into the corner of the back seat as we drove past Barren River into curvy Highway 87, the 2-lane road that took us through the tiny hamlets of Austin and Tracy. I daydreamed about the day ahead, picnic on the grounds, an afternoon baseball game across the road from the cemetery with my cousins, a renewal of the family's relationship with our artist cousin from France. Cousin Dudley wasn't wearing a dress. When he arrived in the late morning, he was surrounded by adoring family members, brothers Dero and George at his elbow, sister Sarah close by. Dud was wearing a dull, yellowish tan trousers and a colorful shirt. It could have been a khaki uniform, if not for the accessories. He had a thin, brilliant orange scarf tied around his neck, knotted at just below the Adam's apple. He wore a patchwork sleeveless vest adorned with small brass buttons. Around his neck, several strands of leather. From one hung an Indian arrowhead. He wore glasses and had graying hair. My dad and most of the other men were dressed in their Sunday best, including neckties that they had yet to take off in the early summer sun. My dad kept his on all afternoon. So there was a notable contrast in how our European visitor was dressed and how our fathers were dressed. I felt a bit self-conscious in my short pants. At least little D, another cousin, had worn long pants. A couple of people shuffled out of the way, giving my sister and me a chance to scoot in a little closer, be introduced, and shake Dud's hand. That's when I noticed his feet. He wore sandals with no socks. Joseph Dudley Downing
born 1925 near the very location of this family reunion, had returned home to be with a host of cousins, aunts, and uncles, and family members. In a sense, all of us had been born here. If you followed the winding highway from the cemetery, past the feed store, and the only cafe in Fountain Run, to a crooked, bumpy dirt path that only a few of the Goodman elders could still find, you arrived at the very spot I mentioned earlier. My father took me there once at the end of a long afternoon of too many ham and biscuits and innings of baseball. The home place I had heard so much about was an overgrown, unmowed field. There were a few planks of weathered lumber lying on the ground near what might have been a stone farmhouse and a foundation for that farmhouse. On that visit, I was a little bit antsy and ready to get back in the car. But I do remember when I caught my father gazing through the imagined structure beyond a rusty, falling down barbed wire fence, and had the sense, just for a few seconds, that this place had meaning for him. That was the reason Dudley had traveled thousands of miles to this family reunion. It was home. Thank you all very much. I'd be glad to if they're from anybody but Charlie. But I'll take one or two from him too. Yes, I'd be glad to answer or listen to anything that you have to say. I'd be honored to. Yes, sir.
I do want to mention one thing. Dudley is buried not in the Fountain Run Cemetery, which is a fairly large cemetery, actually. Now it is, because for obvious reasons. He's buried on what's known as the Dossie Place, just past Fountain Run, where two roads converge. And I've been there. It's up on a little knoll, and he's buried by himself. The legend is that being buried by himself was at the request of his two wives, because they'd had enough of him while he was alive. He outlived both of them, Bill. He had 14 children by his first wife. He married his second wife, named Peggy. By the way, we did genealogy, we find we're related. It's true. He married her when she was 16. He was in his 50s. And he had 18 children by her, and he outlived her. So he was left alone finally, and vice versa. Just wanted to mention. And I was talking about John Jacob.
Yes. Yeah.
Dudley never married.
Hey, Bill.
Yes.
Is Trigg Court in Glasgow named for one of your
Yes.
Trigg ancestors?
Yes.
And if so, why? Was there a homestead there?
Yes. You remember where, well, I mean, Sandra still lives there, where
Sandra and Vinnie's house is?
Yeah.
There was quite a large estate there, and it burned to the ground in, I don't know exactly the date, but it burned completely to ashes, and they had to go through, this is my family's side of the story, they had to go through and sift through to find what remnants of jewelry and artifacts that they could once it burned down. Just, I don't know the date of that. It was somewhere. Sam says 1922.
And also Trigg National Bank.
Trigg National Bank, Trigg Theater, several other. Yes.
Was the Trigg Fox Sound, was that related to?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Developed out of the Walker hounds, by the way, with that name. But a Lanson Trig developed and bred that, and they're still around and being bred here in not too far from here.
There's a plaque in the courthouse honoring tree hounds.
Anybody else? Yeah. Joe Barry?
What is the title of your book?
Beans, Biscuits, Family and Friends, Life Stories.
Everybody needs to read it. It's really good.
Thanks, Wayne. It needs to be updated and added to. How about that? Yeah.
Was that an extra?
It was. That's an essay. There are two essays in there about Joe Downing. And someday, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, and Peggy knows how this is. If life doesn't get in the way, my hope and dream is to write a biography of Joe Downing, of the artist. But it's tough work. It takes time, and I'm still at a day job.
There was a real good documentary several years ago. I don't know if you were involved in it or not, but it was on KET about, not too long before he passed away, where he was, he did a lot of the narration
Yeah.
about his work.
Yeah, Barb Deep did that. Western did that. They produced that, and KET aired it. Yeah. Yeah. If you haven't been to the Baker Arboretum and the Downing Museum in Bowling Green, it's well worth the trip, and I think it's still free. I don't think they're charging any admission at all, and it's right outside of Bowling Green on easy to find and not far from here at all, and it's well worth.
It's well.
Not only the museum, but the grounds of the Arboretum itself are just magnificent. I'd wait till spring, but it's beautiful. It's quite beautiful, and a lot of history of Joe and a lot of his work on display there. Hundreds of his paintings. Anything else? Take maybe one more, and I know y'all are anxious to get on with your day. Well, thanks again to everybody for being here, and once again to the Historical Society and to Sam, and I've enjoyed it so much of being back here, and if there's ever another occasion where you're needing somebody other than Charlie to speak, I'd be glad to come back.